The US is turning Ukraine into a colony. At least that's the gist of the agreement the US and Ukraine are about to sign. The full details of the deal haven't been decided yet, but the idea is that Ukraine will have to pay back a huge portion of the aid used to sustain the war through sales of its rare earth minerals like lithium and titanium, as well as oil and natural gas. Congress committed a total of $175 billion in so-called aid to Ukraine. In exchange for paying back the US, Ukraine is gonna get, well, we're really not sure yet. Because Ukraine has said there's no clear security guarantee in the deal, and it seems like the underlying implication is that Ukraine's incentive to sign is that the US won't let Ukraine sit at the negotiating table if it doesn't pay up. Aid to Ukraine ended up being one of the least popular policies of the Biden administration, and felt like a stab in the back at a time when tens of millions of Americans were struggling to survive. The Biden administration justified it by saying that the United States had a responsibility to protect Ukraine from Russian invasion, but that's deceptive at best. The aid to Ukraine wasn't aid. It was weapons. They were weapon shipments that the US sent to Ukraine to fight a proxy war against Russia that it's been waging for decades. During the Cold War, the United States and Russia, then the Soviet Union, were engaged in a worldwide struggle between their dueling systems, capitalism and communism. In order to contain the Soviet Union, the US, along with its Western European allies, formed a military alliance called NATO, with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. According to Article 5 of NATO's treaty, any attack on a NATO country would trigger a response from all of NATO. Now, since NATO was an anti-Soviet alliance, you might be thinking that there would be no need for NATO after the Cold War. But it was continued, because the US found itself as the sole superpower left in the world after the Cold War, and decided that it was going to maintain its superpower status by destroying any power that might rise to challenge it. One of those powers ended up being Russia. Despite repeated promises from the US that NATO wouldn't expand, in their own words, 1 inch eastwards, NATO expanded into several Eastern European countries, further tightening the noose around Russia that it created during the Cold War. NATO expansion created obvious security concerns for Russia. NATO countries play host to massive military bases and advanced US weapons that would now be right on Russia's doorstep. Furthermore, NATO countries practice huge joint military exercises where they simulate full-blown ground invasions, which could only be interpreted as practice runs for invading Russia. And if Russia objected or had a dispute with any of its neighbors, it would trigger a direct conflict between Russia and all of NATO. On the issue of NATO expansion, Ukraine was Russia's red line. Ukraine has a large economy and shares a massive border with Russia. Despite this, the US spent decades meddling in Ukrainian politics to put pro-NATO politicians in power. In 2004, the US spent tens of millions of dollars sponsoring a pro-EU, pro-Western candidate in the Ukrainian presidential election who was not only a friend of George W. Bush, but whose wife was actually a former employee at the US State Department. The US flooded money into the US Agency for International Development's democracy program in Ukraine, which is essentially a euphemism for supporting political factions that hold pro-US views. Even though the US-backed candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, lost the initial election, pro-Western forces were able to cast doubt on the election results and force a new election, which Yushchenko won. In 2014, the US employed the same playbook, openly funding Ukrainian protest groups who opposed the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych. Even though Yanukovych just wanted Ukraine to maintain a neutral position between the EU and Russia, US politicians try to frame this as Yanukovych being a Russian stooge. Ukrainian Nazi groups like Right Sector, C-14, and Svoboda spearheaded the coup, ran Yanukovych out of the presidential palace, and appointed themselves to key government positions in the new regime. Since the 2014 coup, Western leaders repeatedly flirted with the idea of admitting Ukraine to NATO, which was ultimately the reason Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Listening to the US corporate media, you'd think Putin just woke up one day and decided he wanted to invade another country because he's that evil. What you'll never hear is that for 30 years, the United States and NATO repeatedly violated their agreements, encircled Russia with weapons and military bases, and overthrew governments in its neighboring countries. The Russian invasion gave the West exactly what it was looking for, an excuse to start a direct armed conflict with Russia. And the best part for the West was that Ukrainians, not US or NATO troops, would be the ones doing all the fighting. This is why we say the aid the US sent wasn't aid. They were paying Ukrainians to be cannon fodder in their dirty war.
U.S. President Joe Biden's administration is urging Ukraine to quickly increase the size of its military by drafting younger troops. A senior official says the Biden administration wants Ukraine to lower the mobilization age from 25 to 18 to help expand the pool of fighting-age men available.
So to summarize, the US tries to permanently weaken the Russian government, orchestrates regime change coups in neighboring countries, fails to achieve its objectives, violates all of Russia's red lines in the process, and then uses Ukrainians as mercenaries to fight a proxy war against Russia. And now, the Ukrainian people, who fought and bled to advance the interests of the US military-industrial complex, are going to be sent to mines for generations to pay back the US for this aid. By the way, half the money from this mineral fund is supposed to go to Ukrainian reconstruction efforts, but we already know that that money is going to be siphoned away by corporations. In 2023, Volodymyr Zelensky made a statement declaring that Ukraine was open for business. In the statement, he thanks JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Goldman Sachs for taking part in the Ukrainian reconstruction effort, which Zelensky said would be the largest European economic project of our time.
We have already managed to attract attention and have cooperation with such giants of the international financial and investment world as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Such American brands as Starlink or Westinghouse have already become part of our Ukrainian way. Your brilliant defense systems, such as HIMARS or Bradleys, are already uniting our history of freedom with your enterprises.
In other words, Zelensky's plan has always been to sell off the country's assets. Here's an actual video that the Ukrainian government made about the future Ukraine, complete with AI courts and an ultra-modern Iron Dome.
2030. The history of the new Ukraine is studied all over the globe. Why? Because Ukraine became the most digital and convenient country in the world. Scripts have replaced bureaucrats. 500,000 former public servants are successfully integrated in the new economy. No more red tape, but paperless. No more banknotes, but cashless. Yes, we became the first country to abandon paper money. Ukraine now has the best tax system for the IT industry and the most affordable e-residency. Thanks to Ukrainian engineers and programmers, the R&D centers of the world's top technology companies operate successfully, and Ukraine ranks first in the world by the number of startups per capita. Ukrainian courts are guided by artificial intelligence, and all notarial acts take place online.
So no, the US should have never sent aid to Ukraine, but they should have also never waged a dirty war against Russia. The whole idea that the United States has to be the most powerful country in the world, or that it has to police the world, is the costliest policy the United States is embarking on right now. There are over 800 US military bases around the world and hundreds of thousands of troops stationed overseas. If Donald Trump was serious about cutting spending on overseas conflicts, he would close these bases and bring these troops home. Instead of sinking hundreds of billions of dollars into undermining foreign governments, he could trade with these countries and cooperate with them. It might upset the weapons companies that profit from our foreign policy of nonstop war, but I think for the rest of us, we'll be just fine without them.